Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 12. She's my girlfriend. "It's a gay bar?" Telly all but blurted out, something very close to panic ringing in her voice. Her cheeks were burning, the air around her suddenly seemed to be gone, and she felt her blood pulsating in her ears. "And that's a problem because?" She could hear the amusement in Detective Batan's otherwise very plain statement, and immediately regretted her little outburst. "It's not a problem, I mean..." The redhead started to shift uncomfortably in the back seat of the car she was currently sitting in. Her eyes wandered from Detective Batan over to Detective Alder, behind the steering wheel, and even though she couldn't see her face, just knew that she was biting back a smirk, and was silently enjoying her misery. Partner of the year. "It's just that I think that's an interesting piece of information to have, you know, the fact that the Camarilla killer is only going after gay women. Might be interesting for the profile. Except that this is not the case." Alder decided to break her silence, after all, but kept her tone completely neutral and her eyes focused on the road. "It's not?" Detective Batan turned around and rolled her eyes when she spotted the puzzled expression on Tally's face. "Craven, get a grip. You've literally met the husband of Tanya Flynn. Yes, some of the victims were not, or at least not exclusively into men, but definitely not all of them. There's no indication that the Camarilla killer pays any specific attention to sexuality. It rather seems to be the bar itself that connects those women, not its designated purpose. We don't even know for sure if all the victims have been there. And besides that, you don't need to be gay to visit a gay bar." The teasing tone in Batan's voice at the last sentence made Tally blush even deeper, and she sank a little further into her seat. She was slowly learning to deal with Batan's attitude, and by now, mainly threw some sass her way in order to shut her up. But there was still these little moments where the other detective caught her completely off guard. Moments like this, actually, where she was silently praying for the ground to swallow her. "Right, I knew that. Sorry. It's been a long day." It really had been. Detective Batan had spent all day gathering information about Fort Salem, while she and Alder had been supporting Abigail and Detective Quartermain with the case they were currently working on. When it had already started to turn dark outside, Batan had burst into the bullpen and had announced that they would waste no more time and check out the bar in person. Just like most other bars, Fort Salem wasn't open during the day, so the evening was the perfect opportunity for them to do some poking around. They didn't really have much time to speak about how they would actually approach things at the bar, though. Batan had simply hurried them into the car without sharing any of her intel. So when Alder was about to park in a small alley just around the corner of Fort Salem, Tally raised her voice again, hoping to make up for the earlier outburst by actually contributing something to their investigation. "So, how are we going to do this? I mean, we should probably try to lay low, right? Try to be subtle at this and not raise too much attention? If the three of us just barge in there and push our badge into people's faces, we will hardly get any answers, and in addition to that, scare away any suspect or witness within seconds." She could see Batan nod. Then the other detective turned around again, pursing her lips. "You got a point there, Craven." Now it was on Tally to roll her eyes. Heading head over heels to a place without any actual plan on how to proceed was just a typical Batan move. At this point, she should have probably not even be surprised anymore. But before she could put her frustration into words, Alder spoke up, saving Batan the embarrassment of admitting out loud that she might not have thought this through. Simple. We go in undercover. Detective Batan only huffed and let out a dry laugh. We, as in the cop whose face is currently plastered all over the newspaper, the one the Camarilla killer is evidently obsessed with, and the gay panicking redhead? Tally leaned forward and boxed against her shoulder. Ouch! Batan had a point, though, at least regarding her own, and Alder's well-known involvement in the case, and that meant Tally was basically screwed. Again. But she forced herself to pull it together, and pull out her fake confidence once more. Well, I guess this only leaves us with one solution. The redhead goes in alone. Neither Alder nor Batan seemed to like that suggestion very much, but after a short discussion quickly realized that unless they would postpone their investigation before it had even begun, and would return tomorrow with another cop they would automatically drag into this, Tally's suggestion was really their only option. So after a while, Alder simply closed her mouth and stopped talking, knowing that the fight was lost, but not actually wanting to admit it out loud. Batan, on the other hand, let out a sigh. Okay, fine. Then that teasing grin Tally had grown to fear was back on her face, and she looked right at her, daring Tally. Let's see how good you are at playing gay, Red. Tally gulped, but this time managed to not let herself get thrown off so easily. She simply returned Batan's stare. I thought you don't have to be gay to visit a gay bar. Then she let her voice drop slightly and raised her eyebrow, accepting the challenge Batan had put out. Besides, who said anything about playing? She realized that this was the first time she formulated her new realizations about her sexuality out loud, and on top of that around someone who wasn't Abigail or Rael. Tally was surprised by her own confidence, but sharing this actually felt good, and definitely somewhat freeing. Still, Tally could have sworn she heard Alder gasp quietly at her words. Her partner, however, quickly concealed it with a loud cough. Tally actually had to bite back a laugh at that, because let's be honest, that was actually such a Tally thing to do. It was nice to see Alder struggling for once, but instead of calling her out, forced herself to turn her attention back to Batan, whose response actually sounded mildly impressed. Well played, Craven. Then she got out of the car to grab some equipment from the trunk, and Tally was about to follow her when she felt Alder's eyes on her. She turned around to look at her partner and was faced with concerned blue eyes. Are you sure you're ready for this? Once more, Tally felt her stomach flutter at the genuine concern in Alder's words, but she didn't allow herself to question her decision and replied with a confident nod. Completely sure. Don't worry, it's not like I'm stepping in there to arrest a Camarilla killer all by myself, and you and Batan will hear everything that's going on, so you can come to my rescue whenever I need it. She smiled at her reassuringly, and once Alder nodded and looked slightly more at ease, stepped out of the car to collect her earpiece from Detective Batan. When she stepped inside the bar, a couple of minutes later, however, her carefully constructed facade started to slip, and her nerves took over. She looked around the bar with wide eyes. The place looked quite cozy, a huge bar in the corner, quite a few tables, an area with a pool table, and a couple of gaming machines in the back, a small dance floor in front of it. The dark furniture and dim warm light created a comfortable atmosphere. Generally, there was absolutely nothing unusual about Fort Salem. It was exactly the kind of place Tally would visit in her free time, to get a drink with Abigail and Rael, except for the fact that even though the place was not exclusively a ladies-only bar, she couldn't spot a single male person, only the barkeeper behind the counter, and the number of women around her was kind of overwhelming, and made it hard for Tally to think straight. Quite literally, even. In fact, at the moment, Tally was 100% convinced that she was anything but straight. Tally still stood in the entrance. She felt kind of lost and didn't really know what to do with herself. Then, the earpiece she was wearing started to make a static noise. Relax, Craven. I'm right here with you. It was as if Alder seemed to sense her discomfort, and the calm and collected sound of her voice in Tally's ear was enough to ease most of her nerves. Forget the case. Pretend you are on a normal night out. Just go to the bar, get yourself a drink, and make some conversation. Tally exhaled quietly. Right. Just a normal night out. In a gay bar. On her own. Nothing she hadn't done countless times before. Well, fake it till you make it, right? She straightened her back, then walked over to the bar and sat down on one of the bar stools right by the counter. Almost immediately, the barkeeper, a mid-sized man with dark hair and a silky, bulky figure, turned around and walked over to her. "Hello, little one. Now you definitely look like you could use a drink." His voice was high-pitched and slightly croaky, as if he was a bit hoarse from speaking too much. He also had a very odd way of emphasizing his words, making everything he sound sort of melodic, like he was about to burst out into a song. Before Tally had a chance to reply, he let out a shrill laugh, and while he still had his eyes on her, she no longer felt like he was looking at her, but rather through her. "Don't worry, I have just the thing for you." With that, he turned around and started to hum some musical number. Tally didn't recognize it. She frowned, not sure whether she should be amused or suspicious. Something about that man was definitely off. Tally just didn't know if she was feeling threatened by him, or if he was simply living in his own world. She sat on her chair in silence for a while, watching the men mixing her drink. Then she felt another person slide onto the chair next to her. "You are new." Tally turned her head and was met by twinkling brown eyes that were mustering her intensely. "That obvious, huh?" she laughed, not quite able to hide the awkwardness in her voice. "No, actually. I'm just certain I would remember seeing a pretty face like yours." Tally didn't really know how to respond to that. She only stared at the woman opposite her. Usually she wasn't a fan of bold flirtations, but she was glad someone was putting her out of her lonely misery. And the woman seemed to be nice enough. In fact, when she spotted the rather lost expression on Tally's face, she let out a warm laugh and raised her hands in apology, putting Tally at ease. "Sorry. Cheesy pickup lines are definitely not my strong suit." Tally chuckled, finally taking in the young woman in front of her. She was around her age and had a round face that was framed by short black curls, thick, bushy eyebrows, and cute dimples. Well, I can assure you that I have definitely heard worse. That ultimately broke the tension between them, and the other woman extended her hand to shake Tally's. "I'm Libba." "Tally. The name suits you. Well, Tally, how about I buy you a drink to make up for our bumpy start?" "That sounds great." Then Tally bowed her head, pointing at the barkeeper. Apparently, he already has the perfect beverage in mind for me. I'm not quite sure if I can trust him, though. I prefer to walk out of here on my own 2 feet and not wake up somewhere without any recollection of what happened. Libba threw her head back and laughed wholeheartedly, making it impossible for Tally not to join in. Then she reached out and reassuringly patted Tally's knee. "Oh, so you've met Hurst already? Don't worry, he's harmless. A bit out of it, but nobody quite mixes drinks as he does. His sister owns the place, and he's been working here forever, I think." Tally knew she should probably move, to shrug off Libba's hand that was still lying on her knee, but she couldn't say that she was uncomfortable with the touch, and both Alder and Batan had told her to just roll with it and enjoy herself. So Tally didn't move. "I trust your judgment." She lifted the drink that Hurst had just placed in front of her with an excited squeal and toasted. "You sound like you come here regularly." "Yes, I live right around the corner, and the place is pretty cool. I've heard Hurst's sister's a bit of a bitch, so if you should be afraid of someone, it's probably her. But she's barely around, merely concerned with the finances and stuff, and she definitely knows how to run this place. I mean, they have cheap drinks, good music." She paused and winked at Tally suggestively. "Pretty ladies." Much to Tally's surprise, her blatant flirting didn't put her off at all. She was used to men hitting on her, so this was a nice change. Plus, she liked Libba. The young woman was giving her a careless vibe, and she felt comfortable around her. So why not have a little fun? "Can't argue with that," she smiled widely. They kept their conversation light, and while they talked, Tally managed to ask some more carefully calculated questions about Fort Salem. Libba answered them eagerly, but nothing she said made the place appear in any way suspicious. The 2 women were actually getting along quite well, and soon every last bit of Tally's nervousness was gone. She fully engaged herself in the conversation and enjoyed the attention that Libba was giving her. It was obvious that the other woman was very attracted to her, and if Tally wouldn't be on the job right now, she would probably not even be opposed to her advances. Libba had made clear that she wasn't looking for anything serious, and it might give Tally a little break from the constant ache she was feeling for a certain detective. She had just waved off another one of Libba's teasing comments when the woman turned her head towards the door, and Tally watched her eyes grow wide. Oh, damn. Tally turned around to follow her gaze and froze. Oh, damn indeed. No other than Detective Sarah Alder had just entered the bar, and was walking towards them with large steps like she owned the place. She had lost her white blouse, and was only wearing the white tank top that had been underneath it, and her dark bra was clearly visible through the fabric. She had loosened her braid, and her hair was now falling in light waves over her shoulder. Tally also noticed that she must have put on dark red lipstick in the car, a color that suited her well and made it almost impossible for Tally not to stare at her mouth the whole time. Tally's eyes followed her through the bar. She blended right in with the crowd, but at the same time stood out completely. She stopped right in front of Tally and Libba, mustering them appraisingly, and Tally gulped at her sight. She looked radiant and absolutely pissed. How did you get in here? Tally managed to press out. Alder raised her eyebrow, and quickly her strained expression was replaced with an almost teasing smile. Same way as you, through the front door. Libba next to her had watched their short exchange silently, and was eyeing the older woman curiously. Now, who are you? She asked, obviously intrigued by the vision that was Sarah Alder. She just seemed to have that effect on people. But before Alder could reply, Tally jumped in. She's my... She hesitated and took a sip of her drink to stall some time, suddenly not quite sure what to say without immediately blowing her cover. Girlfriend, Alder added without missing a beat. Tally almost choked on her drink, and while she was trying to regain control over her breathing, watched Alder leaning in close to her. She was feeling completely helpless when her partner leaned in and planted a feather-like kiss on her cheek. Then, she slipped into the space between Tally and Libba and put her arm around Tally's waist, pulling her close, so that the sides of their bodies were pressed against each other. Tally's thoughts were spiraling, and her cheek was still tingling from the brief contact with Alder's lips, her body overwhelmed with a sudden closeness. What in the goddess's name was happening here? She watched Alder wave hers over and heard her ordering some shots. Then she moved one of the glasses over to Tally and wordlessly drank the other one. Once she had finished her drink, Alder leaned in, her lips grazing just over Tally's ear. Drink these. It will make it easier. Relax, just roll with it, she whispered, and Tally's breathing hitched. She grabbed the shot and downed it in one go, slightly shivering at the bitter taste, but then enjoying the warmth of the alcohol spreading through her body. Well, I suppose my presence here is no longer needed. If Tally was completely honest, she had already forgotten that Libba was still sitting next to them. To her relief, though, the other woman didn't seem at all that heartbroken and was still looking quite relaxed. No, I suppose it isn't. Tally flinched at the ice-cold tone of Alder's voice, but the other woman did not seem offended by it. She truly admired Libba for her apparently very thick skin. Still, when she got up and was about to walk away, anger flared up inside of Tally. It's not like Libba had done anything wrong or inappropriate, and Alder had no right to act like that around her. Before Alder could stop her, she quickly jumped to her feet and lightly touched the other woman on her shoulder, smiling at her apologetically when she turned around. Hey, I'm sorry about that. It was really nice talking to you. The smile that Libba gave her in return was still genuine. Don't worry about that. It was great meeting you. She nodded at Alder, who was watching their exchange with a sour expression on her face. You two are quite the pair. Even though she needs to deal with her jealousy issues. She's quite fiery? Fits your hair color, actually. Tally let out a small laugh at that. Anyway, maybe I'll see you around again. With that, Libba turned around and disappeared into the crowd. It took a moment until Libba's words had settled in, and when they did, they left Tally confused. Why would Alder have any reason to be jealous? It was not like her partner was feeling anything for her that would justify these sort of emotions. Still, the fact that a stranger seemed to think she and Alder made a good couple made her stomach flutter. She walked back to Alder and slipped back on her chair. Almost immediately, Alder's arm was back around her waist. This time, Tally hesitated, torn between enjoying the touch and being too pissed to do so, but then gave in and leaned in slightly. Her next words, however, were not exactly friendly. "What the hell was all that about?" she hissed. "You let yourself get distracted. We have a job to do." "The job is to look around and gather information, which is exactly what I did before you barged in here." Her boldness actually made Alder back off a little. Her voice softened slightly, and she sighed apologetically. "Look, I'm sorry for interrupting your little fling with that woman. I am sure I can get you her number later." Funny, if Telly wouldn't have known better, that sudden bitterness in her voice sounded a lot like jealousy. But instead of commenting on that, only rolled her eyes at Alder's probably not so serious offer, then let her continue. "I just didn't want to risk you get sidetracked, and figured we had better chances to get information if we did this together. It's easier like that, to make people trust us. You were right earlier. It's not like the Camarilla killer is here, ready to throw a knife at us. It's a simple observation job, so I wanted to support you. It's not because I didn't trust in your abilities." Well, that was at least somewhat reassuring. Telly knew that there was more to this, but it was clear that Alder was not ready to share her thoughts with her yet. So she decided to let her partner off the hook for now. "Fine, I guess you have a point. Let's do it your way." Telly and Alder spent the next hour around the bar, talking to people. Despite her usual very reserved attitude, Alder was surprisingly good at starting conversations with strangers and getting them to talk about the bar. And Telly could feel her heart skip a beat whenever Alder introduced herself warmly as Sarah, then bumped against Telly and said in her softest voice, "And that's my girlfriend." During their conversations, a couple of other women mentioned the rather uptight sister of Hearst that didn't really seem to fit into a place like Fort Salem, but neither of them knew the name of the woman or what she looked like. Telly vaguely remembered Detective Bataan mentioning her earlier, and made a mental note to research her in more detail. The barkeeper himself actually only seemed to be a very odd yet harmless character, who was really into musical theater. Still, some of the women mentioned that they had caught him staring at them with an intensity that had weirded them out, so Telly was not ready to write him off just yet. Apart from information that was actually relevant to their case, Telly found it very hard to focus on the conversations Alder started. Her partner seemed to be really getting into the whole fake girlfriend thing, and Telly was both impressed and overwhelmed with her acting skills. One of her arms was possessively wrapped around Telly the whole time, and she kept searching for body contact at every opportunity. It was incredibly distracting, especially because each time Alder linked their fingers together, each time she gently put a strand of hair behind Telly's ear and let her hand linger on her cheek, each time she accidentally brushed her leg against Telly's, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Whenever her touch sent another shiver over Telly's body, she had to remind herself that none of it was real, that Alder was only acting the part. But oh, she made it so easy to forget. What kept her grounded and stopped her from getting completely lost in Alder's touch, however, was that nagging feeling inside of her that she was getting watched. She zoned out of a conversation she and Alder were currently having with some blonde woman when she scanned the dim room quickly, couldn't spot anyone who seemed to show any unusual interest in them. She was about to let it go and told herself that she was probably just being paranoid, but just when she turned back around to the bar, her eyes wandered over Hearst, the barkeeper, once more, and paused. She had stopped paying attention to the man a while ago, and had simply decided to ignore this weird behavior for the moment. But now he was standing in the furthest corner of the bar. He was still holding a bottle of gin in his hand, but didn't do anything with it. Instead, he was staring at Telly and Alder, with the same absent expression on his face that had already put off Telly before. And Telly fully understood why he was freaking some of the other women out. She wanted to just shrug it off, but when she and Alder moved on to talk to another woman, it was undeniable that he was following them with his gaze. Telly shivered, suddenly very creeped out by the whole situation. She grabbed Alder's wrist and leaned forward. "I think the barkeeper is getting suspicious. He probably noticed that all we seem to be doing is chatting up his customers," she whispered, and pointed her head slightly in the direction of Hearst. "He keeps watching us." Alder only nodded. "I have my eyes on him as well. I'm sure something is off with him. But if we just continue to linger around the bar, we definitely won't find out what he's up to, now that we are on his radar. So what do you suggest?" She watched Alder turn her head in the direction of the dance floor, which was still close enough to the bar to observe it, but would get some distance between them and the barkeeper. Tally knew exactly what Alder would say next, and when her voice dropped slightly, she knew she was doomed. "Dance with me, Craven." She offered Tally her hand. Tally wished she could blame the alcohol for her next move once more, but she had barely drunk more than that one shot, so maybe she was simply drunk on Alder, her constant touch and closeness. Her thoughts immediately went back to the police ball and how good it had felt to dance with Alder, how safe she had felt, how alive. So how could she deny an offer to repeat all of that, to feel like that again? So she stopped thinking for the moment and winked almost playfully. "Stealing my nines now?" Then she took Alder's hand without any hesitation. "What can I say?" Alder linked their fingers together and lead them towards the dance floor. "You're an exceptional dancer." Tally waved off the compliment with a low chuckle, but was screaming internally. She was feeling so lightheaded that the words seemed to be slipping out of her without any control. "Then dance with me, Alder." She let go of Alder's hand and confidently moved onto the dance floor. She had always enjoyed dancing. Usually, she preferred doing it alone in her room, but Alder's words were still ringing in her ear and encouraged her. She started to move to the music, her hips swaying, her arms reaching above her head, and she felt the rhythm and started to lose herself in the music. Alder was watching her the whole time. Even in the dim light, Tally could feel her eyes on her, watching her movements, letting her eyes wander over her body. She closed her eyes, and suddenly they were no longer undercover in some bar, trying to catch a serial killer. It was just the two of them. They were all that mattered. Tally heard Alder move, could feel her coming closer and felt her own pulse racing, her breath quickening in anticipation of what was to come. Then Alder's hand was on her hip, and Tally placed her own on top of it, entwining their fingers once more. Alder started to move with her, pulling her closer. Soon, Alder's front was pressed completely against Tally's back. She felt Alder's warm breath on her neck, felt long fingers moving her hair out of the way. Then her lips were ghosting over Tally's pale skin, not quite touching it, but sending goosebumps all over her body instead. Tally reacted on instinct. She pushed her own body back even more against Alder's, arching her back to give the other woman better access. She would have imagined their dance similar to the evening at the police ball, careful, searching, intimate. But this was different. It was raw, passionate, driven by the heat that had been constantly building up between them, not only over the evening, but the last weeks. She heard Alder gasp when she let her hands slide backward, one cupping her head closer against her, the other finding its way to her thigh. Could feel Alder's muscle clench under her touch as she tried to bring their bodies even closer together. Her ass was now pressing directly against Alder's center, and she heard the breathing of the older woman quicken when Tally started to roll her hips slightly. Alder leaned into the contact, grinding shamelessly against Tally, then started to let her own hand wander up Tally's body, brushing the side of her breast as she did so. Her touch sent a delicious chill down Tally's spine that coiled in her core. She did not even try to stifle the low, sinful moan that escaped her lips, and clenched her thighs together. Alder's lips were back on her neck, this time actually placing small kisses on it, slowly making their way upwards. Then her teeth were grazing her earlobe, and moments later, Alder's husky voice was in her ear. "Your barkeeper is on the move." And just like that, the moment was over. Tally's eyes flew open, and she blinked, still slightly dazed. Slowly, the noise of the talking and dancing people around her came back to her, and embarrassment flushed her when she realized that without even touching her properly, Alder had once again managed to get her into a state of arousal that she had never really felt before. In the middle of a dance floor, with many other people around, while they were working undercover. Fuck. The fact that she was still pressed against her partner did absolutely nothing to ease the tension in Tally's body. She exhaled, desperate to get her spiraling self back under control. And with the self-control she didn't know she still possessed, stepped away from Alder. She focused on Hurst, who was at the moment throwing one last careful glance over his shoulder and then vanished through a small door that probably led to the back rooms of the bar. And damn it, Tally started to develop a serious dislike for that man. That had only partly to do with the fact that he was a shady creep that seemed to be up to no good. Then she turned around to Alder, who was still slightly out of breath. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair a tangled mess, and her eyes dark, clouded with lust? Tally could feel her own breath hitch at the realization that no matter how good Alder was at playing the role of her girlfriend, that dance had affected her just as much as her, and she was definitely just as unsatisfied with its sudden ending. Alder mustered her expectantly, and Tally cleared her throat, desperately hoping her voice wouldn't fail her. Well, then let's go. Without another word, the two hurried through the bar and followed Hurst through the door, ignoring the no access sign deliberately. The door led them into a dark hallway. In another situation, Tally would have laughed at the irony. Of course, she and Alder would end up in a dark hallway once again. But now that her cop senses slowly started to return to her focus was elsewhere. It had to be, or else she would drag Alder back to the dance floor, or even better, back to her apartment to finish whatever they had just started. She quietly crossed the hallway, sensing Alder right behind her, and stopped in front of another closed door at its end. She paused, put her finger to her lips, to give Alder a sign to stay quiet, and listened. She could hear someone moving behind the door, could hear the clinking of bottles, and then the muffled yet clearly recognizable high-pitched voice of the barkeeper resonated through the wood. At first, she thought he was talking with someone on the phone, but quickly realized he was having a conversation with himself. Strange women. So many women. More drinks, always the same. Tally moved even closer, desperate to hear more than just some snippets, but it seemed like the man was actually only talking gibberish. Nothing he said was making sense. But then he muttered one word that made Tally's blood freeze. Camarilla. Despite the closed door, she understood the word clearly. Her brain was so busy making sense of it that she almost missed the sudden silence from the room, then the sound of steps slowly walking closer to the door. Her head snapped back. Apparently, the barkeeper had finished his business and was about to return to the bar. Tally's eyes widened in panic when she realized there was absolutely no way she and Alder would make it back through the hallway in time. Her thoughts tumbled, trying to find a way out of this before it was too late. If Hurst would catch them here, their cover would definitely be blown. There was nothing that Tally could say to explain why she ended up in that part of the bar, her ear pressed against the door, to what seemed to be a storage room. Getting caught spying on Hurst would make their investigation so much harder, and would take the one advantage they were currently having away from them immediately. But there was no way out. Or so Tally thought. However, just when the door handle was already pressed down, and Tally thought their fate was sealed, she could feel Alder move behind her. She didn't have any time to react, only felt her grabbing her arm, dragging her away from the door, into the dark corner right next to it. Alder twisted her around, effectively pushing her against the wall. Then, just when the door opened and Hurst stepped out, a couple of bottles in his hands, pressed her lips on Tally's, capturing them in a kiss. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.